In the desolate Kuiper Belt, the Arcturus drifts, unaware of the Zorath war spheres lurking in the shadows. A blinding flare erupts, and Captain Lysandra Cain faces an alien empire's wrath. Can one human's unbreakable will defy their mind? Shattering Crucible? Dive into this gripping tale of resilience. Like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more thrilling stories, and to fuel our creative journey. The Arcturus drifted through the Kuiper Belt, its sleek, unassuming frame dwarfed by the vast emptiness around it. A mere speck in the cold black sea of space, it was a human exploration vessel, no more than 35 meters in length, carrying only a handful of crew. Its mission, charting the farthest reaches of humanity's solar system. The crew, just for souls, were oblivious to the looming nightmare. They were too far from Earth, too far from anything that could offer them protection. Then, in an instant, everything changed. A sudden flare of light, a burst of energy beyond comprehension, ripped through the quiet of the Kuiper Belt. In an eye blink, the Arcturus was surrounded. From the shadow of a nearby dwarf planet, Zorath war spheres emerged, their dark, impossibly massive forms stretching more than 1.5 kilometers in diameter. The warships appeared like titans, each one bristling with armament that could tear a moon apart. The human ship was a joke, a blip in the Zorath's path. The Arcturus tried to flee, its thrusters flaring as the crew scrambled to respond. But their ship was too slow, outgunned and outclassed. With a single pulse of energy, the war spheres disabled the Arcturus's engines. The ship now nothing more than a floating corpse. Zorath boarding pods detached, cutting through space with surgical precision. They landed silently, their advanced retaliate technology making them virtually undetectable until the very last second. Within minutes, Lysandra Cain, captain of the Arcturus, was dragged from the wreckage of her command deck. Tall, fiercely composed, and with her gaze unyielding, she stood against the tide of alien invaders. The Zorath captain, towering over her, expected her to crumble. But instead, Lysandra met his eyes, her expression eerily calm. "Think you can break me?" she asked, a thin smile tugging at her lips. The Zorath were used to seeing fear. This human would be no different. Or so they thought. The Zorath fleet dragged the Arcturus, now a crippled husk, into orbit around a dying star, its gravitational pull stretching the remains of the ship like taffy. The human crew was taken aboard, one by one, subdued in silence. But for Captain Lysandra Cain, silence had never been a weakness. She stood defiant as she was escorted toward the heart of the Obsidian Crucible, the interrogation fortress designed to break minds. The Crucible was not like anything human technology could fathom. Orbiting a star on the brink of collapse, it was a floating monolith of black stone, pulsating with eerie blue lights. Its diameter spanned 1.2 kilometers, a construction of impossible intricacies. Its design an expression of Zorath's superiority. The fortress was lined with psycho-disruptive fields, invisible energies that interfered with cognition, warping time and space with each step. Lysandra was brought to the core of the Crucible, where the gravitational chambers kept her feet heavy and her head spinning. She glanced around, noting the faint hum in the air, tuning into the subtle frequencies of the Zorath's reality-bending technology. Her mind processed it all instantly, cataloging the weaknesses in their systems. The Crucible was designed to destabilize human minds, yet Lysandra, composed and analytical, could feel the familiar weight of technology. This wasn't her first encounter with advanced systems. "Welcome to your new home, human," the Zorath overseer Clither's voice boomed, his eyes narrowing with calculated amusement. He stood at over 2.3 meters tall, a towering figure of muscle and metallic plating, his mind a weapon honed over centuries of psych manipulation. Lysandra met his gaze, unfazed. Her pulse was steady, the calmest it had been since the ambush. "Home," she said softly. "I'm not staying long." Clither's cold smirk widened. This was the human the Zorath were about to learn to fear. The chamber was alive with movement. The Crucible's walls shifted, their surfaces rippling as if breathing. Holographic projections materialize in the center of the room, each one more horrific than the last, a hellish reimagining of Earth's destruction. Explosions rained down on cities. Oceans boiled, sending thick clouds of steam into the sky. Acidic rain fell, dissolving human skin, while twisted. Monstrous versions of human figures writhed in agony. Lysandra's eyes remained calm, her breath steady as the world around her melted into chaos. The Zorath watched with rapt attention. They'd used this technique 1,000 times before, designed to break any prisoner within minutes, to drown them in their deepest fears. Yet, Lysandra remained untouched by the spectacle. Clither stood at the control panel, observing the results. The Zorath had perfected this technology, able to generate images and sensations so real they could collapse a mind. The environment hummed, growing louder, as synthetic screams echoed throughout the chamber. The Zorath were sure this would be it. This human would beg, but she didn't. Her gaze remained fixed on the burning cities. Her fingers twitched slightly, as if testing the limits of her restraints, but that was all. No trembling, no fear. "This is just a projection," Lysandra muttered, her voice low and even. She could almost feel the technology that powered the simulation, the subtle hum of its frequencies in the air. "I've been through worse." Clither's eyes narrowed. Impossible. No human had ever reacted this way. The psychological pressure was perfect. This wasn't just torture. It was an unrelenting wave of horror. Yet, she was standing there, dissecting it. "Is this all you've got?" she asked, her voice now a sharp, icy edge, cutting through the terror. "You think your holograms will break me?" The Zorath technician, Sora, stepped forward, attempting to push deeper into Lysandra's mind. She sent waves of empathic distress, designed to flood the human with despair. But Lysandra's pulse remained steady, no change. This was no longer an interrogation. It was a puzzle, and Lysandra was already several moves ahead. The air in the crucible thickened. Lysandra's heartbeat remained steady, a mere 78 beats per minute, perfectly synchronized with her breathing as if she were still aboard the Arcturus, calmly navigating space. But this was no peaceful voyage. The Zorath had ramped up their efforts. The chamber around her pulsed with energy. Holographic terrors shifted and morphed, bending reality itself. The walls dissolved into viscous shadows, and the space seemed to shrink. The first hallucination appeared with a sickening pop, an image of her mother, standing in front of her, face gaunt and worn, a portrait of agony. Her mother's voice, distorted by the underlying hum of the crucible's frequencies, filled the air. "You left me, Lysandra. You didn't save me. You never cared enough." The emotional probe hit her with calculated force, an empathic strike designed to pierce Lysandra's resolve. It was as if her deepest fears and regrets had been siphoned straight from her mind. Her mother's betrayal twisted her gut. Lysandra's gaze didn't falter. Her eyes narrowed as she focused, analyzing the pulse patterns in the air, detecting the subtle shifts in the energy fields. This was manipulation, artificial, layered with emotional toxins, but ultimately predictable. She could feel the distortion, but she wasn't moved. "Mother," Lysandra whispered, her voice ice cold. The illusion shattered. The image of her mother flickered and collapsed as the reality weaver's influence faltered. Clither watched, intrigued. This was the first time a subject had fought back so quickly. Sora, the empath, attempted a deeper push, sending waves of guilt and sorrow directly into Lysandra's consciousness. The emotions were so dense that they felt like a physical weight on her chest, suffocating her. But Lysandra's mind was sharp, her focus clear. She simply dissected the flood of emotions, analyzing it like an algorithm, complex, yet comprehensible. The Zorath had underestimated the resilience of the human psyche. They had assumed that their superior technology could break a mind in minutes. But what they failed to account for was the human ability to compartmentalize, to turn pain into a weapon. She barely blinked, now smiling faintly. "You really thought that would work? It's just data. I'm not your experiment." The crucible shook again as the projections began to distort further. The Zorath's control slipped, and for the first time, The overseers exchanged uncertain glances. The game was no longer simple. The human wasn't resisting. She was dismantling their tactics, piece by piece. The Zorath's control tightened around the chamber, but their methods were starting to fray. The wall projections flickered, distorting under the pressure of Lysandra's unshaken composure. The Arcturus's captain wasn't resisting, not in the way they understood. She wasn't fighting back in a physical sense, nor was she pleading or breaking under the weight of their psychic manipulation. She wasn't giving them anything to work with at all. She was observing. Lysandra stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the intangible horrors created by the Zorath's advanced technology. The reality-weaving machine twisted the air around her, forming chaotic scenes that blended nightmare and reality. First, she saw Earth reduced to ash, its cities in ruin, the ground cracked open by quakes, the oceans roiling with massive waves that consumed all life. Then, a cold laugh echoed from her mother's lips, accusing her of failing her. None of it made her flinch. The images were disjointed, shifting violently. But Lysandra's eyes narrowed. Her mind was a precision instrument, and she understood this technique. The projections were just data she had seen countless times before, in simulations, in books, in training exercises. These were simple tricks, designed to pull at emotions. But emotions, she knew, were only tools to be used, not chains to bind the mind. With an almost imperceptible movement, she activated a small tech module embedded beneath her sleeve, human technology, seamlessly woven into her suit, designed for deep space exploration. But with a secondary function, it began sending a low-frequency pulse through the room, just beneath the threshold of audible sound. It interfered with the Zorath's psychic interference, creating a momentary disruption in the holographic projectors. The projections flickered and vanished for a split second, long enough for Lysandra to take a breath and recalibrate. In that second, she understood the Zorath's core flaw. Their control was based on assumptions about fear, about emotion, about the inevitability of submission. What they didn't account for was the mind of a human. Lysandra lifted her gaze, calm, but searing with precision. "Your projections are powerful, but they are limited," she said softly, as the Zorath's manipulations tried to rush back in. "You've forgotten one thing. A human mind doesn't break when faced with chaos. It adapts." Silra, the empath, pushed harder, sending waves of false guilt, layering them on top of the previous emotional assaults. Her face twisted in concentration, trying to force Lysandra into the collapse. The pressure was nearly unbearable, but Lysandra simply cataloged it. She was examining Silra's attempts, her methods, seeing the threads of psychic influence and tracing them back to their source, calculating. "Your empathy is just a projection of your own weakness," Lysandra said, her voice cutting through the mental fog. "You don't understand us. You think emotions are everything, but all you've done is expose your fear." With that final line, the Zorath team felt it, a brief but sharp ripple in the air. They were losing control. Lysandra wasn't just enduring. She was rewriting the terms of engagement. Their technology was vast, but it couldn't predict her intellect, her will. Clither looked at the others, the first signs of real doubt creeping into his once immovable expression. The Zorath were starting to realize that this human wasn't just breaking their technology. She was learning it, turning their strength into their weakness. The Crucible's core trembled as the Zorath resorted to their final weapon, the Ian Fracture Protocol. Clither, once calm and confident, now stood at the edge of desperation. His hands moved with precision, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his movements as he activated the protocol. The air around Lysandra crackled with raw energy as the walls distorted, bending like thin sheets of metal under immense pressure. The Ian Fracture was a forbidden technique, the pinnacle of Zorath's psychological warfare. It wasn't just a simulation. It was a weapon that shattered the mind, sending the subject through infinite timelines, each one a different version of Earth's downfall. It fractured reality itself, forcing the mind to live through all the possible failures of humanity, a constant loop of despair, pain, and loss. There was no escape. There was no hope, or so the Zorath thought. Lysandra's body jerked slightly, the strain of the Ian fracture causing the world around her to shift uncontrollably. She saw 100,000 versions of Earth, all of them dying, burned, torn apart by invaders. Her mother's voice echoed again, this time a distant, hollow accusation. You failed. You could never protect us. Then, the fabric of reality twisted again. Earth was reduced to dust, cities collapsed, oceans boiled. Humanity's last hopes crushed beneath the weight of Zorath domination. Lysandra felt the rush of infinite failures. But inside her mind, where others would have screamed, she remained eerily composed. She was calculating the damage, assessing the flow of each timeline, tracking the subtle fractures in the Zorath systems. Every failure had a cause. Every failure could be undone. Is this all you have? Lysandra muttered, her voice a faint whisper in the chaos. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. Her thoughts raced as she started pulling at the seams of the Zorath's fractured timelines. She knew how this technology worked. She could feel the fractures, the glitches in their system. She wasn't just enduring their assault. She was taking it apart. Her eyes flashed, sharp and calculating, as the walls around her shifted once again. This time, they morphed into a vision of a humanity rising. Earth, victorious, its people vying in defiance of the Zorath. The very thought of humanity's resilience, its capacity for recovery and strength, began to unravel the Ian fracture's hold on her. The human mind was not built for despair. It was built for adaptability. The more the Zorath tried to break her, the more she adapted. The projections flared. Earth fell again. Then, it rose once more. The timeline shifted endlessly. But in the center of this chaos stood Lysandra, unaffected. Her mind had become a machine, no longer simply reacting to the assaults. She was pulling data from the fractures in reality and reassembling them. Every failure the Zorath showed her, she turned into an opportunity. Every death of humanity she witnessed, she transformed into a victory. The Crucible trembled more violently now. The reality manipulators were overloading. The walls cracked as the immense energy needed to fuel the Ian fracture began to destabilize the fortress itself. The quantum core, pushed beyond its limits, began to whine and whir, warning that the system was on the verge of collapse. You are failing, Lysandra said, her voice no longer soft, but firm. Not me. Silra, the empath, stepped forward, her hands shaking as she tried once more to reach into Lysandra's mind. The empathic waves of guilt, despair, and helplessness crashed against Lysandra's psyche. But they were nothing more than fleeting distractions. Lysandra's mental walls were fortresses now. She could feel Silra's weakness. She was exhausted, and every attempt to break Lysandra only made her more aware of the Zorath's vulnerabilities. Lysandra's mind sharpened like a blade as she identified the weak points in the Zorath's hold. The pulse from her suit's subspace modulators had been working quietly, constantly interfering with the Zorath's reality-vying frequencies. It was a subtle, almost undetectable disruption, yet it had been enough. With one last thought, Lysandra made a choice. She focused all of her awareness on one simple truth. The Zorath are afraid of humanity's resilience, and now, I am showing them why. With that final realization, the Zorath's reality-fracturing machine began to collapse. The walls of the Crucible, once so sure of their dominance, began to crumble. Reality itself was starting to buckle under the pressure of Lysandra's mind. She was not a prisoner. She was the architect of her own escape. The quantum core's alarm began blaring, its systems wildly out of sync. As the Crucible entered a rapid destabilization, the Zorath had unleashed their deadliest weapon. But in the end, it was humanity's strength that broke them. The Crucible's core shuddered violently, the feedback from the destabilizing quantum systems reverberating through every inch of the fortress. Lysandra stood at the center of the chaos, her expression as calm as ever. Despite the intense pressure building around her, She could feel the walls bending, the reality-shattering forces at play. But she was no longer just enduring. She was driving the instability. Each failed manipulation by the Zorath, each miscalculation of their technology, had given her another piece of the puzzle, another way to unravel their control. Clither's once commanding posture faltered. He gripped the edge of the control panel, his fingers trembling slightly as he watched his empire's technology fail him. The Zorath had always been able to control minds, to bend reality. But Lysandra was doing something impossible. She was adapting faster than their systems could recalibrate. Impossible, Clither muttered under his breath. He glanced around at his team, the first cracks in their collective composure becoming apparent. Silra, the empath, looked pale, her face contorted in confusion. Torvox, the reality weaver, had begun to sweat, his usually steady hand twitching at the edges of his control interface. Their projections, their simulations, were slipping. The timelines they had constructed were becoming too erratic to control. Lysandra's mind was now a razor-sharp tool, slicing through the layers of their manipulations with surgical precision. She could feel the faint pulse of their equipment, the hum of their advanced technology as it tried to reassert itself. But with each surge of energy, she sent out a calculated countermeasure, a low-frequency disruption from the quantum core of her suit, perfectly timed to intercept their control signals. It wasn't a brute force attack, but a subtle recalibration of the fortress's very energy signature. The Zorath's advanced tech had never encountered anything like it. "Your control is slipping," Lysandra said, her voice cold but certain. "You're losing your grip." The Zorath's grip on the Crucible's systems faltered again, as the room around Lysandra began to distort wildly. The temperature spiked, and the walls started to crack, their pristine surfaces bleeding flashes of unstable energy. Silra attempted one final push, projecting waves of despair directly into Lysandra's mind. But the pressure was too great. Lysandra simply let the waves crash against her, calculating, analyzing, dismissing them as irrelevant noise. The Crucible's once unbreakable structure now groaned under the strain of Lysandra's focused will. The systems were failing faster than even the Zorath could process. The Zorath had assumed their dominance was absolute. Now, in the face of the human mind's resilience, they were beginning to understand just how wrong they were. The Crucible groaned, the very air vibrating with the weight of its collapsing systems. A low hum resonated from the core, followed by a sharp whine that cut through the room like a knife. Lysandra felt it, the destabilizing quantum core, pushed past its limits, was on the verge of catastrophic failure. The Zorath had never anticipated this outcome. They had designed this fortress to be impenetrable, a mind-bending labyrinth that no species could survive. But the longer they tried to break her, the more they revealed the cracks in their own technology. Now, those cracks were widening, and the entire structure was beginning to splinter under the pressure. Clither's grip tightened around the control panel as the lights in the chamber flickered, and the floor beneath him trembled. The temperature spiked, pushing past 60 C, and the walls around him cracked like dried clay, revealing the dark void of space outside the Crucible's shell. There was no more pristine control, no more overwhelming power. The Zorath were out of options. "Shut it down," Clither barked to his team. But even as the command left his lips, he knew it was too late. The fortress was beyond their control. Lysandra's calm demeanor remained unbroken as the walls fractured further, exposing the raw instability of their once mighty structure. Lysandra stood in the epicenter of the chaos, her arms relaxed by her sides. The Zorath could not understand how she wasn't panicking, but for Lysandra, this was just another problem to solve. She could hear the subtle frequencies of the Crucible's technology, the hum of the quantum core, the unstable flux of energy in the walls, the subtle shifts in the gravity fields. Each pulse of failure was a new data point. Each crack in the foundation of the Crucible was a path toward victory. With a swift motion, she activated a secondary function on her suit, a series of electromagnetic pulses calibrated to disrupt the failing energy fields around her. The walls around her shimmered with static, as if the Crucible itself were in pain, and in a moment, the entire chamber began to implode. The Zorath systems were not just failing, they were disintegrating. "Abort!" Torvok screamed, but his voice was drowned out by the escalating disaster. The Zorath's carefully constructed reality weaving was crumbling, and with it, their grip on the Crucible. Lysandra's mind was clear. She was still calculating, still ahead of them. As the Crucible's gravity-well chambers began to collapse in on themselves, Lysandra simply took a step forward, her boot making a quiet thud against the shaking floor. She walked toward the exit with purpose. The systems were collapsing. The Zorath were panicking. But she, the lone human in this broken fortress, had already won. The alarms blared as the room ruptured in all directions. Lysandra, unshackled, was the only thing in the chaos that remained unmovable, and now, uncontainable. The final tremor of the Crucible's collapse shook the very foundations of the fortress. The once mighty structure, which had orbited a dying star, now lay in ruins, its quantum core flashing dangerously as it spun out of control. The Zorath had failed, and the signs of their panic were unmistakable. Sparks flew from broken panels, and alarms blared across the twisted remains of the fortress. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the cracked walls as the vast facility slowly began to tear itself apart. Kuiper, his towering form hunched with desperation, staggered toward the exit. Sweat beaded on his forehead, and his eyes, once filled with ruthless certainty, now reflected the abyss of fear. "Prepare the ships," he shouted hoarsely to his team. "We leave now." But his words were hollow. The Zorath's once impenetrable control had been shattered, not by force, but by the sheer resilience of one human mind. The fortress was dying, and Kuiper knew that the Zorath had just encountered something they could not conquer. The mind of a human. Lysandra stood in the center of the chaos, unfazed. The Crucible's collapse had been the culmination of her efforts. Her mind had dissected their tactics, calculated their weaknesses, and turned their own technology against them. The Zorath had relied on their sophisticated systems, their reality weaving, their empathic probes, but they had overlooked the most basic truth of all. Humans were not predictable. They could adapt, they could learn, and, above all, they would never break. She took one slow step forward, her boots clicking softly against the cracked floor. The Zorath had underestimated her at every turn, assuming she was just another prisoner, another mind to bend to their will. They thought they knew everything about psychological manipulation, about breaking spirits. What they hadn't accounted for was humanity's ability to adapt, to remain unbroken, to survive against impossible odds. As Lysandra walked through the wreckage of the Crucible, she felt no triumph, no exultation. She simply felt the calm after the storm. Her technology, a combination of human ingenuity and meticulous preparation, had done its job. Her pulse was steady, steady enough to survive the Zorath's worst. And as the walls crumbled, she knew, the empire that had conquered thousands of worlds, that had brought species to their knees, would leave this place with a bitter realization that humanity was not just a species to be conquered. Humanity was the storm that would one day tear their empire apart. The Zorath fleet was already retreating. Lysandra watched them go, her gaze unwavering. The galaxy would not forget what had just happened. It would be a reminder to every species. The children of Earth were not to be underestimated. As the Crucible's last fragments dissolved into the void, Lysandra stepped outside, her eyes focused on the endless stars. The universe had just been irrevocably changed, and humanity was no longer a mere speck in the vast cosmos. They were a force, one that would change the very fabric of existence.